when we could be having a way to make sure that our family members get the education they need to get a job and move forward in their lives. Welcome to Conversations with Your Congressman. I'm John Tierney. I have the honor and pleasure of being your congressman, and with me today I have two terrific guests. We're going to talk about a subject that I hear a lot as I go through my district. People are concerned about the disparity in income and wealth and what that means to our economy, what that means to their lives. And we have two uniquely qualified guests here to talk about that and the budget differences. We express our differences and our values through our different budgets, and we have one for the majority Republicans and one for the Democrats. And so we want to talk about the differences and what that means in policy. I have with us Jared Bernstein, who's a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. From 2009 to 2011, Jared was the chief economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden and also the executive director to the White House Task Force on the Middle Class and a member of President Obama's economic team. Jared's areas of expertise, in part at least, are federal and state economic and fiscal policies, income inequality and mobility, trends in employment and earnings, international comparisons, and analysis of financial and housing markets. His PhD in social welfare is from Columbia University. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And we have Chris Van Hollen, my colleague, who's the congressman from Maryland's 8th District. He was first elected in 2002. He is the top Democrat of the House Budget Committee and the point person on the budget and economic legislation in the House. The Washington Post described Chris as a bona fide budget expert, and the LA Times said he's among his party's best budget minds. Before Congress, he served in the Maryland House of Delegates and the Senate. He has degrees from Swarthmore, Harvard, and Georgetown University. Welcome, Chris.
It's good to be here, John.
Thank you. Look, I have to share it with you, what you already know, and Chris, you know it from going around your district. People are mad that there are some people that seem to be being extraordinarily enriched on that, getting a lot of benefits on that, and not contributing their fair share, even though they're probably getting more of a benefit of tax dollars than other people might be. And others are hardworking people working every day, lifting productivity to new heights, but not seeing any increase in their salary or their wages and not seeing themselves being able to catch up and even stay even, never mind get ahead on that. By one measure, I guess the disparity in this country is as high as it's been since 1928. Emmanuel Saez, who's we all know to be an economist, had some numbers that I'll share, and I wrote them down here. He said that in 2012, estimates were that the top 1% received 22.5% of pre-tax income, and the bottom 90% had fallen to 49.6%. So that's a big difference than what it was in 1982. In 1982, instead of 22.5%, the top 1% got 10.8%. And the bottom, instead of just sharing 49%, got 64%. So it's sort of a lopsided buy on that. And the wealth, of course, as opposed to income, is even greater than that. I mean, the top one-fifth, the richest one-fifth, have 88.9% of the wealth. So, Jared, can you speak to us a little bit, you know, what about this highly imbalanced current economy that we have, and what are the politics behind it? What's the cause of it?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to talk about this topic, because it is so compelling to people, just as you said, these days. And I don't know that everyone is walking around with these numbers in their head, but I think everyone's walking around with this issue in their head in one way or another, a sense that they're working harder, kind of doing what they've always done, but the likelihood of getting ahead seems diminished. The causes of the great increase in income concentration or wealth inequality that's behind the numbers you cited are multifaceted. So there's no one thing that's causing this. Economists tend to say two things. Economists say globalization and technology, which, by the way, doesn't really explain all that much. It just sounds like kind of words with a lot of syllables, so it must be right. Yeah, all right. I actually think that's part of the story, but I don't think it's the whole thing. Briefly, and I know we'll have time to get into this in more depth, certainly expanded trade has led to our workers, particularly in our manufacturing sector, competing with those from abroad. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. We actually have a highly productive manufacturing sector, and we could effectively compete. However, other nations manage their currencies in a way to make our goods more expensive and their goods cheaper. So right away, we see some policy and some politics. So before we say just globalization and trade as a factor, let's get beneath the surface and figure out ways in which policy is making it harder for our manufacturers to compete. Technology, well, it is true that people with higher levels of skills have always achieved higher pay in the job market, but there used to be a time when someone who was not everybody's a college graduate. In fact, viewers may not know this, but it's about 2/3 of the workforce is not college, does not have a college degree. So the majority of the workforce is not college educated, and historically those folks have been able to do a lot better than they are now, and that has a lot to do with the big missing thing in that globalization technology argument, and that's bargaining power. A lot of workers don't have the bargaining power that they used to have, and as long as I'm talking to two members of Congress who think about these things, and I'm not trying to be solicitous, but a lot more deeply than a lot of other members of Congress, I will say that there was a time when public policy had your back if you were someone who was in the working class. And that time is past. And it's one of the reasons why those numbers turn out the way they do.
Well, and it's not a phenomenon just in the United States. I mean, even the International Monetary Fund has spoken out against the fact that this big disparity, the upside down aspect of it, is not good for any economy.
That's true. And in fact, what the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, their research has added an important little nugget to this. Two things. First of all, they've shown in preliminary work, so I don't want to overstate this because it's new research and you kind of need a lot of papers like this before you really think it's true, but there is something to it, and my work has found some similar things. They find that when inequality gets to levels as high as it is now, it actually can have a negative impact on growth. So it can actually hurt the economy's ability to move forward. In part, we talked about this a second ago. If politics becomes skewed, if tax policy becomes skewed such that folks at the top are paying less than their fair share, that means that there's less resources to provide people with the opportunities, the education they need. So you can see where that inequality down the road would hurt growth. And secondly, this is very important, recent IMF work suggests that despite what you hear all the time from particularly conservative economists, if you actually engage in the kinds of investments and programs to help those on sort of the have-not side of the equation, that's pro-growth. That's actually helpful. Now, it seems commonsensical, but people often say, well, if you provide unemployment benefits, if you raise the minimum wage, if you give people an education program, that's going to somehow backfire and they're all going to leave the job, or whatever horror story you want, fill in the blanks. And some recent research shows that not to be the case.
Well, it's interesting. I used to be the president of a local chamber, the Salem chamber up there, and we always thought of everybody in the neighborhood as your customers. So whether they were getting your service or they were buying your product, these are the parents that you were in Little League coaching with, or your kids were doing things with, and if they were out of work, wasn't that a good thing for you? Even if you had your own small business. I mean, this was not good. And if they weren't getting a raise and didn't have more money, then they weren't spending it with you. So intuitively, I think there's a real connection between, sometimes labor unions or other people that are employees and the small business owners who are like that, who sort of need each other. And you see it constantly, people try to drive a wedge between the two as if there's a difference on that basis. But I think Paul Krugman says, your spending is my income, my spending is your income on that basis.
True.
But Chris, so we sort of laid out the landscape here a little bit about what the overarching situation is, but if we can distill it down to these competing budgets prospect of plans that people have of moving forward, tell us a little bit about Paul Ryan, who's the budget writer for the majority, the Republicans of the party, and what his proposal would do, and tell us what the Democratic proposal that you've been the lead author on would do that's different.
Sure, and
in a nutshell.
Absolutely. Well, let me try and summarize it. And first I would say, Henry Ford boiled this down to a very simple idea, because he was asked, why he was paying his employees the wages he was when he could at that time have been paying them less. And he said, look, I need someone who can afford to buy these cars that are coming off the assembly line, so I want to make sure I pay my workers enough so that they can buy my cars. And as you said, you got to think of the customers. The problem with the Republican budget is it makes all the problems we've been talking about in terms of economic inequality, which actually then can have a drag on the economy, worse. And our Democratic budget actually makes the kind of investments that we need to make in our people to help provide that ladder of opportunity to help make their lives better. So for example, in our budget, we make investments in education and training, starting with early education, when people's brains are in formation, kindergarten through 12, And then we want to make sure people have a chance to go on to higher education, whether it's community college or 4-year, whatever it is, to make sure they have the skills to compete in that global marketplace. The problem with the Republican budget is it tears down those ladders of opportunity. And why do they do that? It's because when they look at our long-term deficit challenge, they say we're going to tackle that challenge simply by cutting important investments in our workforce and people, and refusing, and this is the important point, refusing to close one single special interest tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit. Think about that. They won't get rid of a special tax break for corporate jets, for hedge fund owners, for big oil companies. And when you take that off the table, you say, I'm not going to close a single tax break to help reduce the deficit. Who's left? Everybody else. And so that means they come after the investments that we want to make in education for our kids. They come after the investments we should be making in scientific research, which has helped propel our economy. They come after important investments in our infrastructure, which used to be a bipartisan consensus, right, which helps grow the economy. And they come after important social safety net things like Medicare, prescription drug coverage for our seniors, and other important programs. So they come after all that in order to protect the special interests.
And I think one of the parts that I've noticed is that it has the theory here that if you give people making millions or billions of dollars a tax break, that somehow the rest of us will benefit from that. But in the same process, we all ended up, my small business people, my employees would end up paying about $2,000 a year more.
Well,
you know, it's like, so they're taking and say, well, we're going to give these guys a real break over here because they've got a lot of money, therefore they must be really smart, so-called job creators, which obviously hasn't worked because they've had all this money sitting on it. But it's going to cost all the rest of you a couple $1,000s a year if you got kids, whatever, doesn't matter. So I mean, I find that disturbing.
You're right, John. I mean, look, it's based on this totally discredited theory of trickle-down economics, the notion that you give a tax break to the folks at the very top, somehow it's going to trickle down and lift all boats. The problem with that theory is, of course, it crashed with reality in the year 2000. The only thing that grew was not jobs, but our deficits. Right. And then when it came time to deficits, instead of saying, okay, we're going to go back and ask the folks at the very top to pay a little more, they came after everybody else in important investments. But it is important to emphasize that in this Republican Ryan budget, they would actually cut the top rate for millionaires by 1/3, from 39% to 25%. Now, they say they're going to do that without increasing the deficit, which means, as you say, they're going to have to increase the tax burden on middle-income families to pay for it. And their whole rationale for doing that, yeah, you know what? Economics tells us that they can maybe take a little bit more of a hit as long as we're providing the folks at the top with this cut. It will benefit everybody else at the end of the day. We know that's not true.
On that point, in the Republican budget, there is an asterisk the size of Pluto, which basically says we're going to close enough loopholes in order to offset these huge tax cuts.
That's how they're going to get the new revenue.
But as you heard Congressman Van Hollen say, there's not one loophole identified, so it's kind of a trust us thing.
Well, we've also given them plenty of opportunities to close loopholes, and they've shown that they're not inclined to do that. But you made the point, Jared, I think, that obviously, look, there's got to be some revenues here. And Chris makes the point, sure, the revenues, a good portion of them can come from closing loopholes. There's no reason that oil companies need to have tax credits and discounts on that. No reason why hedge fund people should be paying capital gains taxes on something that should be income tax, and there's no reason that people like Warren Buffett should be getting a lower tax rate than his administrative assistant. You were on a panel, I think we mentioned just before we got on here recently, where all of the economists on the panel, who were from the conservative realm all the way to progressive realm, were sort of agreeing that you need some revenues here to do the kind of investments that will make your economy start to pop.
It's exactly true. We testified in this, I don't know if it was in this building, but in front of the House Financial Services Committee, and it was not the most enlightening 2.5 hours of my life, I'll have to tell you, because the panelists, as you said, there were 3 Republican witnesses and myself, and we all agreed just as you said. Now, not everyone agrees on precisely how you would raise those revenues, but everyone agreed that if we're going to get on a sustainable budget path, just like, by the way, you get to in your budget, it's going to take some new revenues if we're going to meet, I would say, the needs and the challenges of the future. One of the things that bothers me about politics these days, if I can make that complaint, is that too often we hear members of the political establishment, and I think this is a problem with the Ryan budget, say, you can have everything here and it's going to cost you here. It doesn't work that way, and I think honest budgeting of the type we've been discussing shows that if you want this, then it's going to cost this. I think the president actually has a nice idea that he has in his budget. I think you may have it in yours as well, where you say, instead of, we have all these tax deductions and loopholes, and you could go through one by one and try to figure out which one you're going to close, and then you're going to fight with every single lobby that you're invoking there. Instead, what if you were to say, for every tax deduction that someone over a particular high income level takes, instead of taking that deduction at their top rate of 39.6%, they'll take it at 28%. So they'll still get the tax break, but they won't get it in that sort of upside down way where the very wealthiest get the largest exemption. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I support that idea. As Jared says, then you're not fighting over what particular deduction you may reduce, but you're saying for very high income earners, you should get the same deduction in terms of the value, the percent value, as the average Joe.
It's a real simple
and
idea.
It's a basic idea, and it helps generate revenue by closing these disparity in the benefits from tax deductions, and that way you can address these other needs that we're talking about and help reduce the deficit without devastating important investments in
and
our
without
kids'
watching
future.
the lobbyist army show up and start picking away
That's
at
right.
this thing, and,
That's right.
it just drags it out and sometimes ends in failure on that. Jerry, you recently were in front of the Education and Workforce Committee, in which I serve, and you were there for the express purpose of talking about education and skills and jobs and what that means to the economy. Can you give us just a thumbnail? We only gave you a few minutes to talk in front of the committee before we started hitting you with questions.
Is the red light going to go on when I talk for too long?
Exactly.
Sure, it's a great question, and I appreciate your service on that committee in the interest of this critical part of the solution to the problem. Look, one of the things that economists know, I think we say a lot about what we know, but this is something we really know, is that people with higher levels of skills and education, they just do better in the job market for reasons that I think the three of us and anyone listening to my voice understand. And one of the problems you have in a highly unequal society is that the barriers to that kind of opportunity, the ability of somebody to achieve, someone who's in the bottom half or the bottom 20%, a kid in a poor family, the barriers for them to actually achieve their intellectual, their academic, their productivity kind of potential get higher and higher and higher along with this inequality problem. We're more and more becoming a society where behind gated communities there are children whose parents are able to lavish all kinds of opportunities on them, and the public sector keeps getting deprived of the resources it needs in order to provide folks with the education that they need. And so I think that the importance of public support for education and skills from preschool, as you heard Congressman Hollen mention, all the way through college access and completion is essential. But if our budgets fail to allow for that service because we're slashing the heck out of it, what we're going to have is just reinforcing the generational aspects of this inequality for generations to come.
Well, you know, we spent a lot of attention on the education and on the Workforce Investment Act, the job skills thing on that, and it's critical. But Chris, when I look at Paul Ryan's budget, the Republican budget, and it says, as you mentioned, we're not going to bring any new revenues in by closing loopholes or any other way, but we're going to have to come up with all this money. If we cut the top rate by a third, then we lose all those revenues. And we're going to come up with it by sort of reducing everything else, but we're not going to tell you what else we're going to reduce. That's the thing. So when you say, oh, you're devastating program A or program B, they'll say, well, we didn't say that. We just said that we're going to make that decision. So if, in fairness, if you just took the amount that would have to be cut to make up for that third reduction on that and spread it proportionally across everything, tell us what it does, Chris, to education at the elementary level, at the college level on that. Tell us what it does to the job skills programs and things like that.
Well, sure. And first, thank you, John, for all your focus on this issue of education and jobs. I mean, you've been just a great leader on this. And what their budget would do is devastate the progress we have made and prevent us from making any additional progress. So if you take their budget, as Jared described it, this magic asterisk, right? They cut huge amounts across the board, but they don't tell you where. And when you point out that this means a 24% cut in K through 12 education compared to where we are today over the next 10 years, they say, oh, no, we're not going to do that in education. You say, well, you're going to take it out of the science investment budget at the National Institutes of Health. No, we're not going to take it out of there. But you know what? If you don't take it out of NIH, then you're going to take more out of education. If you don't take any out of, you're going to take more than 20%. So the answer to your question is 24% cut from where we are now. And right now, we're at inadequate levels in terms of investment in the areas of education and scientific research. So that means 24% cut to early education Head Start. That means 24% cut to K through 12. And they saved $28 billion, not by closing down a tax loophole for a big oil company, but by starting to charge kids in college interest while they're still at school before they get a job. So the choice that they make, that's just one example, $28 billion cut to our kids' college education affordability because they won't close some of those special interest tax breaks.
I'm going to do it. I wasn't planning on doing it. I'm going to do an advertisement right here or anything. About 2 weeks ago, I filed a bill in the House to try and help those kids that were already out of college, you know, and paying interest rates at 7.5%, 8%, 8.5%, 9%, sometimes up to 13% and 14%.
Yeah.
They're dying. You know, they can't buy a car, they can't get out of their parents' house, they can't move on with their life. So I filed it in the House, and Elizabeth Warren filed it in the Senate. It just basically said, look, you know, if we just did what Warren Buffett suggested and change our tax code so that people like him up in that stratosphere wouldn't pay a lesser tax rate than their administrative assistants, took that recaptured money and put it in a pool so that a student with that high interest rate could go in and refinance, just like businesses can refinance and homeowners or whatever. It saved them anywhere from $40 to $100 a month, thousands of dollars on their loan. And Joe Stiglitz tells me, you know, the economist, that basically $16 to $21 billion back into the economy writ large. You know, this is the type of stuff, that's the direction we should be moving in. That's the direction we started to move in when we cut the interest rates on the need-based loans in half on that, and we're moving on that. And along comes people with a budget that say, no, we're not only not going to do that, we're going to start making kids pay the interest while they're in school.
That's right. So you're trying to make it better. They take us backwards. And again, all because they refuse to close some of these special interest tax breaks.
And so the only thing I would add to all that is that here's an example of what I was talking about in the very beginning when you asked me kind of the broad picture of the inequality story. There was an era that I'm old enough to remember. There was an era, frankly, so are you guys. There was an era where you actually could count on government to kind of have your back in precisely this way. Sure, an economy like ours creates inequalities. That will always be the case. Nobody here is talking about some sort of deal where everybody gets the outcomes are the same. Right. That's not anything we've ever had. It's not something we ever will have. It's not something I would want. But we would like to make opportunity available in a way that's much more equitable. And that's where the public sector comes in. It's not about, this is not about welfare redistribution. This is about providing opportunities in a climate, in an inequality climate, where those opportunities are harder and harder to come by. So what government ought to be doing at a time like this is making education more available to kids from, the youngest age till they're through with college. And what you're describing is at least one side of the aisle is making it harder, antithetical to exactly where we are.
Well, in the same committee that you testified in front of, Jared, we had witnesses, about 19 of them, I can remember this, talking about what the most important thing you could do. I asked, what is the most important thing we could do as an investment in education? 19 for 19, preschool, early childhood education. But nobody knew how you're going to pay for it, nobody's going to make it. You find a way, Chris, in your budget to have this happen. At least every 4-year-old and start moving in that direction in partnership with the states and others to get it done. The other alternative budget would just wipe that notion out.
Well, that's exactly right. Our budget, like the president's budget, makes room for this really important investment in early education. And it gets to the point that Jared and you have been making, which is, and Republicans often distort that. When you have these important investments, they try and claim that this is just redistributing income for the purpose of trying to have everybody at equal income. That's nonsense. We have an economy where hard work and competition are the rules of the road. People who work hard should be able to succeed. And that's why the investment in opportunity is important. So we don't guarantee results, but we should guarantee equal opportunity. And that's why early education is so important. We want to make sure kids get a good, fair shot right from the start.
Well, but for the kids, but also for our economy. I mean, every
Oh,
employer
sure.
that I know needs to have people that can really be innovative and bring their companies forward and have new products
Absolutely.
and stuff.
By
and
the way, it's
all of
not
that.
just, you said for the kids, you said for the economy. You're both right, for the budget.
Right.
It's actually, these programs actually return far more over the life of the child than they cost. And this is not my research. This is the research of Jim Heckman, for example, who I believe is on the Republican side of the aisle on a lot of issues, but he's a very well-established economist who, along with this, my point is that this is not a partisan issue. As you said, the witnesses paraded through, I'll bet you a lot of those were Republican witnesses who said investing in early childhood is good for the kids in terms of opportunity, it's good for the economy in terms of their productivity, but also these folks are going to end up costing less in a fiscal sense, and they're going to end up contributing more in a fiscal sense. So I'm not trying to say there's a big free lunch here. It takes work, and there are some revenues associated with it, but it's an idea whose time is long, came a long time ago.
Yeah. I mean, I sense the frustration on the street as people think that, you know, some things are happening, helping one group of people, whether it's big corporations or wealthy people, whatever, at the expense of everybody else. And I think the flip side of that is let's everybody do well. You know, let not just the big corporation, not just the wealthy, but the regular people too. I mean, it used to be that way, and there's nothing to stop us from having policies that return it. Chris, I think your budget reflects that very clearly. You know, we have a nice path that we're going on. We've cut the deficit of more than half. We're trending down.
Yeah.
We're stabilizing it. Jared, you and I were talking earlier how we're getting to a point of good stabilization of our fiscal situation. And part of that is by making the investments that get everybody back in the game and put people to work and have them be contributing aspects on that. So, look, I can't say enough about the work that you do, Jared, you know, like in making sure that we talk about the broad aspects of that and seeing how it really translates down to reality and policy. And Chris, you've been, as I think the Washington Post, the LA Times, another note, a real budget expert for us on the Democratic Party. And it's hard work to distill all those views and policies into a budget document. You've done it, and we appreciate your work.
Thank you for all your input on that.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. We appreciate it. It's
Thank
been
you,
a quick
sir.
show, and I could talk with you both, I'm sure, for a lot longer, but we only had that period of time, and hopefully we'll get you back again some other time.
My pleasure.
Look forward to
Thank
it.
you.